Hello, welcome to my lecture, Stephen King's Magical Negroes. I'll be discussing the magical Negro literary device as used in Stephen King's work, but also a broader presentation of how Black characters generally appear in his work and the impacts and issues that come with them. My name is Scott Woods. I'm a writer and arts producer in Columbus, Ohio. I've published 3 books. And for the last almost 30 years, I've also worked in public libraries. Also, I recently won an Emmy for a poem. So, how about that? Before we get started, I wanted to give a heads up in a couple of areas. First, a word on language. I will be quoting King's work where some rough language appears, so be prepared for that. If the title wasn't warning enough, this may not be a safe for work or children presentation, but I don't know where you work and I don't know your kids. You have been duly warned. This heads up also applies to content regarding sexual abuse and similar horrific acts, which are minimal in this presentation, but they are present. There are 2 phases you won't hear me use in this lecture. The first phrase is the word problematic. The word problematic is problematic in that it's vague and kind of a dog whistle. It's often used as shorthand for things we don't want to take the time to explain. Well, I have all the time in the world here, and I'm the only one talking. So when I mean something is racist or sexist, that's what I'll be calling it. The other phrase I won't be using is the N-word. I'll be saying nigger where it applies because that's what Stephen King wrote. I don't even use that word in my Black life, but you'll hear me say it several times here because we can't get to the root of things by erasing the crimes. I also feel compelled to offer a spoiler alert. This is a lecture, not a movie review or a book review. As such, I do not hem my findings of King's work to avoid spoilers. It is academic work. And in that work, spoilers are frequently part of discovery. So you're going to catch some hot ones in this presentation. That's just how science works. As we begin, understand that none of this is about telling Stephen King or any other writer what to write. It's about conveying what I take away from what he writes. Millions of people over decades have read what King writes, and for various reasons, most of them never considered any of what I'm talking about today. That should be impossible, but it's the reality, and it's worth unpacking. Finally, a quick word on what this lecture isn't about. This isn't about branding Stephen King as a bigot. I'm not out to cancel Stephen King. This isn't personal. This is about engaging a body of work and interrogating the results of thousands of creative decisions over decades of popular literature. What you do with that information is up to you. I think that's all the preamble I need to give. So let's get into it. Who is Stephen King? Stephen Edwin King, born September 21st, 1947, is an American author of horror, supernatural fiction, suspense, crimes, science fiction, fantasy, and nonfiction. His books have sold more than 350 million copies worldwide, many of which have been adapted into feature films, miniseries, television series, and comic books. Since his wife, Tabitha, rescued the pages for what would be his first book, Carrie, out of the trash, King has published over 79 books, including 63 novels, as well as 11 short story collections and 5 nonfiction books since 1974. He has written over 200 short stories, most of which have been collected in anthologies. King is someone the term household name was created for. Even if you don't own a Stephen King book, you know who he is and what he does for a living. How this lecture came to be: back in 2015, I was invited to submit an essay to a now defunct journal, Union Station Magazine. That essay, called Stephen King's Magical Negro Problem Isn't Magical, was the first of several essays I've written over the years about the subject of King and his Black characters. Eventually, I made a lecture out of it, mostly just for kicks. I've done this lecture several times in the past, and it's different each time. There are three main reasons for this. The first is King is frustratingly prolific. With the exception of 1976, King has published 1 to 2 books every year for the last 48 years. Once in a blue moon, he'll release 3. With the explosion in recent years of movies and television series using his source material, I have to keep refreshing this lecture around the edges. I don't dwell on projects that King didn't have a hand in, like movies and series, unless he did, but I still need to be conversant in them. I have to keep up with his universal output, which wouldn't be so heavy if I were just doing book reviews a couple times a year, or if I was just casually reading them. But that's not what's happening, which brings me to reason number 2. The scholarship doesn't exist. Doing the Stephen King Magical Negroes lectures takes more effort, research, and time than anything I ever did in school. The problem isn't just that King has so much work. I've read most of his books as they came out. I got the volume hurdle licked. The challenge is that in almost 50 years, very few people ever stop to say, I wonder where Black people might figure in the canon of one of the most successful writers of all time. So I have to not only know King's work, but I have to go back through it with a goodie pick and pull out this pocket universe of characters that millions of readers over 50 years have simply decided weren't worth talking about in a larger socio-political context. Now, I have seen groups dedicated to the smallest circuit board on a Federation class starship, all the way to the thread count on a Doctor Who scarf. But nobody took the time in 50 years to simply catalog King's Black characters, let alone determine what the symbolism and impact of them in this enormous and enormously popular body of work might be. There isn't a lot of research on the intersection of Stephen King and racism. There are a lot of assumptions, but not a lot of source material. So those of us who care have to create that body of work, research it out, and draw conclusions about it, and then, listen to random people on the internet tell us we're sensitive. Third reason, racism keeps evolving. Racism is fluid, so as time passes, it morphs to maintain certain power structures and systems. As that occurs, the study of racism deepens and broadens. So I have to stay on top of the ideas, history, and language of racism, as well as Stephen King books. It's a lot like trying to name all of the constellations in the nighttime sky while simultaneously counting the grains of sand on a beach. But enough about how I spend my weekends. Let's take another step deeper into the matter. Let's begin by going back to a dark place and an even darker time, Reddit in 2013, where a random white middle-aged Stephen King fan named Old Tom Joad asked, "Hi folks, just reading The Stand at the moment, and I have noticed that King frequently uses the word nigger. I'm currently on chapter 35, and every time King mentions Black people, he uses the word, so on and so forth. I understand that King has racist characters in his books, and that he uses nigger when he is writing from their perspectives, but I find him using it in his narrator's voice in The Stand. He throws the word in every time he refers to black background characters, and it's becoming jarring. So on and so forth. Also, TLDR, I think King uses nigger excessively and has some dubious portrayals of black people in his books. Does this make him a closeted racist? End quote. This is almost a perfect question. It asks for the opinions of others in a more or less reasonable and very transparent way. Though I might have cautioned him about his hard R nigger usage. Frankly, even that is instructive for our purposes here. Bottom line, he wants to interrogate his impression, meaning his read or opinion, of a specific value, meaning racism, used in specific ways, meaning the use of the word nigger. He probably didn't expect any black folks to see this, so he's got a couple of blind spots here in this question. But otherwise, this is an almost perfectly academic question. He even provides some support materials at the bottom in line 3 links, right? Which was almost the sum of material to be had on the matter in 2013. Now, here is a sampling of the responses he received in kind. Nah, I think he's trying to get you uncomfortable and inside the mind of these characters, which is what he does best. Ask yourself another question based on the same reasoning. King uses murder, dismemberment, rape, and a lot of other nasty shit in his books. Does this make him a closeted murdered? Or what on earth could be racist about his portrayal of Odetta? She suffers horrific racist abuse and turns out to be a heroine in spite of it. Alice Walker could have written Odetta / Susan. Also, considering the fact that he has a white character, Eddie Dean, and a black character, Susanna Dean, get married in the Dark Tower series, I would call him far from racist. Also, no. In fact, he is vehemently anti-racist. He loves to portray black characters as saints or sages. Okay. And so then the last thing, he does often give black people magical powers. John Coffey in The Green Mile comes to mind, and Mother Abigail in The Stand. Where else has he done it? I don't think that's the end of the quotes. I don't think I'm talking out of school when I point out that Reddit really let old Tom Joad down here. Let's see if I can't give old Tom Joad and the people like him who have this itch in the back of their head when they encounter this intersection, the answers they're looking for. So, my relationship to King's work is a pretty straight line. Here's the baseball card stat version. My first King book was Firestarter in 1980. I was 9 years old at the time. It was my older brother's book. My first King movie in a theater was Cujo in 1983. My favorite King novel is The Dead Zone. It's also the book I recommend most often for people's first King novel. Out of hundreds of short stories, my favorite remains The Mangler from the collection Night Shift in 1978. My favorite King movie adaptation is The Shawshank Redemption from 1994. King is a writing influence for me as well, mostly in terms of work ethic, less so content. For much of my life, I'd read King without too much trouble. I enjoyed the books a great deal, and he was an author I collected. I would go out and buy them. I worked in one of the largest public library systems in the country. Whenever Stephen King published anything, I had the ability to reserve a copy in such a way that when the titles hit bookstore shelves on release day, a copy could be waiting for me first thing in the morning when I showed up for work, absolutely free. I could be reading a new Stephen King novel by lunch without having gone an inch out of my daily routine. And yet, I never reserved his books. I always went out and bought them. Rather than have the book delivered to me for free, I expended gas and time to drive out to an actual brick and mortar store to purchase it. Uh, but in 1996, I began to feel as if something was awry. This was the era of the Green Mile. The movie wouldn't come out for another 3 years, which I was plowing through in monthly installments as it was King's first mainstream attempt at a serialized novel. Every month, a new installment of the story would drop. This went on for 6 months, and by the end of it, I was in a real state. I can't say I was entirely unaware that King used Black characters in ways that felt odd to me. But to me, the Green Mile's John Coffey was not merely odd, he was a problem. That light bulb moment is representative of the long standing conflict many Black readers have had to navigate with King novels. On the one hand, we love the work. The ideas are compelling, the characterizations memorable, the craftsmanship clear. A good Stephen King novel is a joy. On the other hand, anyone would have to admit that Stephen King has a recurring tick, and it's not just his frequently suspect endings. King creates Black characters that make me want to burn libraries to the ground. What was the problem? In The Green Mile, the character John Coffey is a magical Negro of the highest order. He's not a handy sidekick. He's a self-sacrificing lamb on the altar of grotesque caricature. Despite being taken with the story, I refuse to deny the way it made me feel as a Black person. I was offended around the edges on several levels to the point that I was mad at myself for not questioning Stephen King's potential for this kind of characterization before. Why had I not taken issue with his Black characters in previous works? Were they not as badly drawn? Was I just not tuned in? So now seems as good a time as any to talk about what a magical Negro is. Let's start by stating what a magical Negro is not. Any Black character with magical powers is not automatically a magical Negro. They may be in a literal sense, i.e., a Black person with magical powers. But that's not a trope in and of itself. That's just a character, and we wouldn't refer to them as a Negro in 2022. Black people are allowed to be superheroes and wizards and villains, but a magical Negro, generally speaking, has more distinct characteristics and patterns. It is a literary device and conversely has a few rules. If you go on Wikipedia, you'll see this definition. The magical Negro is a supporting stock character in fiction who, by use of special insight or powers, often of a supernatural or quasi-mystical nature, helps the white protagonist get out of trouble. That's not a bad definition, but it lacks nuance and is missing an ingredient or two. In 2001, legendary filmmaker Spike Lee was at a speaking engagement, and he spoke out on the heels of the release of the film The Legend of Bagger Vance. He suggested that John Coffey and Bagger Vance were both, quote, a reincarnation of the same old stereotype or caricature of African Americans as the noble savage or the happy slave that has been presented in film and on television for decades, end quote. Spike referred to them as super-duper magical Negroes. Not long after that, in 2004, author Nnedi Okorafor, who has written many books, most notably Who Fears Death and the Benty series, among others, wrote an essay for Strange Horizons entitled Stephen King's Super-Duper Magical Negroes. It has since become the starting point for most serious discussions about the magical Negro trope, Stephen King's or otherwise. Part of the reason why that's true is because Okorafor lays out 5 common, not absolute, common attributes of a magical Negro. 1, He or she is a person of color, typically Black, often Native American, in a story about predominantly white characters. 2, he or she seems to have nothing better to do than to help the white protagonist, who is often a stranger to the magical Negro at first. 3, he or she disappears, dies, or sacrifices something of great value after or while helping the white protagonist. 4, he or she is uneducated, mentally handicapped, at a low position in life, or all of the above. And 5, he or she is wise, patient, and spiritually in touch, closer to the earth, one might say. He or she often literally has magical powers. Individually, these attributes aren't necessarily a problem, depending on how hard you hit your brand. Writers are allowed to have characters in wheelchairs. White writers are allowed to write Black characters, and vice versa. If you write stories that take place in locales where Black people aren't typically found, it shouldn't be expected that large groups of Black people or culture would figure greatly into the narratives. But when you begin to combine them in an alchemy of characterization, you get something very specific. And we recognize what it is because there's a history and a pattern. You get the magical Negro plot device. Stephen King didn't create the magical Negro trope, it's just his jam. There are a lot of related tropes and devices, almost entirely negative across the board, that we can use that also apply to many Black characters: the wise janitor, the token Black friend, the happy slave, the mammy, etc. But it's important to note that the magical Negro may not always be actively magical. They frequently are in King's work, but not exclusively. What differentiates them is context and effect. We cannot always know a writer's intent, but we can always apply context and impact to the work they leave behind. I will admit, it's often a thin line filled with nuance, ripe for interpretation, but all such tropes basically come from the same root: the idea that people of color, Black, Indigenous, Asian, and so on, are different in ways that are exotic and othering. For Black people, we aren't often afforded the more quote unquote beneficial attributes that racism confers on non white people. We get the tough ones, the ugly ones, the dismissive and grotesque ones. We are at the root of most of these tropes, at best, noble savages or a credit to our race. And you can't get to a best like that unless you start off from a place that's subhuman. That's hard to hear, but it was the basis for the entire enterprise of slavery. And it continues to be the unspoken value system that enables racist systems to function in modern society. This is why imagery is important. And the imagery of the 20th century's most popular author is important almost beyond measure. What's wrong with being magical? Well, stereotypes erase the history of people. They flatten the life experiences of people. They remove the interior worlds of people, gutting them like a Thanksgiving turkey of their values and stuffing the husk with something else. How a given stereotype does that depends on the people doing the stereotyping and the people being stereotyped. But this is why, even when a stereotype sounds laudatory, sounds like a good thing to be known for, it isn't, because it simply doesn't reflect reality. Those impressions are transferred from media and art into audiences, and where nuance, experience, and history are not present, they take root in our value systems, which then infect everything from our faith to our politics to our personal relationships. During slavery, certain ideas had to be installed in European and early American society to allow for it to occur. And so there was a transcontinental effort to change the very definition of what it meant to be human, which basically boiled down to white people are human and Africans are not. Once you stop seeing people as fully realized people, you can convince yourself that anything that happens to them is okay. They're not people. This is math we see in action every day still. And it is why the magical Negro is so powerfully wrong. It is not just a lie, but an erasure. And it is a conceit that allows for horrific treatment of real people in the real world. It is a construct. It is quite literally an it. The magical aspect of the trope implies that whatever thing that rises above average or is exceptional in a Black person comes from a source beyond their natural abilities or humanity. It is how we end up with notions like Egyptian pyramids being built by aliens or Egyptian civilization having little to no African influence and being rolled up into the Middle East. What's interesting about those two examples is how they illustrate the sliding value of race depending on the accomplishments of the subject. When the Egyptians were the furthest away on the timeline from European influence building pyramids, they weren't human enough to have constructed them. So people attribute it to aliens and mystery. When white people wanted to bask in Egypt's glory while colonizing it, they made it non-African, as if Africa has ever been just one thing. But then when you make it a dark continent that need not be studied or preserved or honored, you fill that intellectual gap with fantasy and stereotypes. Anyhow, the magical Negro. Sidney Cusick writes in her 2021 essay, The Magical Negro Trope in Literature and Film, quote, "The magic of the magical Negro is not a superpower for Blackness, it is a tool for whiteness," end quote. It is, as Okorafor points out, subordination disguised as empowerment. In the media of the magical Negro, despite your amazing gifts, you must uplift or aid the white character at all cost. This characteristic is more common than whether or not the character has magical powers. Again, magical powers are not mandatory here. The sacrifice is more important than the magic because the real mystery and magic lies in trying to figure out why a Black person in the position these characters find themselves in don't save themselves. Also, when I say sacrifice, I don't mean they always die. There are other things that are sacrificed in the name of the white character, like personality and history and family and feelings and goals. What are some examples? Timothy from The K, Jim from The Adventures of Huck Finn, The Legend of Bagger Vance, Whoopi Goldberg and Ghost, Lawrence Fishburne, kinda, but Gloria Foster, Mary Alice, definitely from the Matrix films. Uncle Remus from Song of the South, Mr. Bloom from The Twilight Zone, the movie, and The Shining. Morgan Freeman and Bruce Almighty, Morgan Freeman and Evan Almighty, Morgan Freeman in the Lego movie, Morgan Freeman and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, John Henry Folk Hero, Sam from Holes. The magical Negro is a cliched, derivative, prejudiced shortcut, born of social anxiety about, fear of, or hate towards Blackness. Note, magical Negro is not an Uncle Tom or a Mandingo or a Mammy. These are separate stereotypes with separate attributes and considerations. Multiple characterizations may exist in a single character. One can be a magical Negro and a Mammy, or whatever combination you like or dislike, but they are not interchangeable labels. White people don't see a problem with magical Negroes because they think that imbuing a Black person with magic and wisdom instead of dimensionality, families, and dreams of their own is some kind of boon. That such gifts would be seen as anything other than an attempt to do right by such characters rarely occurs to them. Such notions play on and reinforce anti Black ideas. There is something very superior about hearing an oppressed person say, I'm not magical, and telling them in turn that magic is cool. How does all this play out in the work of Stephen King? Don't take my word for all of this as a problem. Listen to what Stephen King had to say about it back in 1983. He was being interviewed for Playboy. Playboy asked him, along with your difficulty in describing sexual scenes, you apparently also have a problem with women in your books. Critic Chelsea Quinn Yarborough wrote, quote, it is disheartening when a writer with so much talent and strength and vision is not able to develop a believable woman character between the ages of 17 and 60, end quote. Is that a fair criticism? That's Playboy talking to Stephen King. His response, yes, unfortunately, I think it is probably the most justifiable of all those leveled at me. In fact, I'd extend her criticism to include my handling of Black characters. Both Halloran, the cook in The Shining, and Mother Abigail in The Stand are cardboard caricatures of super Black heroes viewed through rose tinted glasses of white liberal guilt. And when I think I'm free of the charge that most male American writers depict women as either nebbishes or bitch goddess destroyers, I create someone like Carrie, who starts out as a nebbish victim and then becomes a bitch goddess, destroying an entire town in an explosion of hormonal rage. I recognize the problems, but can't yet rectify them. Stephen King wasn't even asked about his Black characters, y'all. He offers this criticism freely. At this point in his career, he's only written 10 books. Only 2 Black characters appear in them, The Shining and The Stand, and they're both magical. At this point, he commits the sin that all well meaning white people do. They think knowing is doing. So, Stephen King is an assembly line of magical Negroes, and his are some of the most famous representations of all time. The Stand, The Shining, The Green Mile, The Talisman. He has more than his fair share. Plus, his magical Negroes are extremely popular, which compounds matters. With an all shucks, everyman ease in his narrative style, King's characters are slick but insidious functions of long standing fears of and projections upon Blackness. What projections? The brute, or being physically frightening, sexualized, or able to be brutalized sexually without consequence. Savage, noble or otherwise, a savage is a savage. Stupid or dense, less than human or subhuman. Some of these projections are slavery old, and a couple are even older than that. You'll recall some of these allusions to descriptions used in the cases of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, the first of whom was endowed with superhuman strength, and the latter of which was described as being, quote, superpowered and possessing a demon face. And these were victims. Something I want to point out is that I use the word projections where a lot of people use impressions. That's because projections puts the cause of the untruth where it belongs, on the observer. An impression suggests that Black people have actually done something to have earned whatever negative stereotype exists, when the reality is that those stereotypes are projections by non-Black people that are reinforced by society, media, and systemic structures. Anyhow, these ancient anti-Black stereotypes and projections are as real today in the white mind as they were 400 years ago. And why is that? Because they're projections supported by entire industries and socio-political systems with a little grease on the wheels by the occasional worldwide best-selling platform that is Stephen King. In 2017 alone, King was a cottage industry all over again. He released 2 books, 4 movies, and 2 TV series in 2017. The man's work is culturally ubiquitous, which ramps up the risk in its takeaways. There is no particular phase of King's career when he has been more inclined to use the trope. He used the magical Negro as early as his 3rd novel, Dick Halloran in The Shining, 1977, then planted various magical Negroes off and on throughout his 50-year career. He then revived his original Negro of stupendous and jaw-dropping ability for a repeat appearance in 2013's Dr. Sleep. Magical Negroes not only bookend his output to date, they appear throughout his canon. That said, we're not talking about D.W. Griffith here. At the end of the day, we're not talking about a lot of characters. King just has a lot of books and stories. Out of 70 plus books, King has given a range of brief to significant speaking parts to perhaps a dozen or so Black characters. By itself, the number of times Black characters appear in a writer's catalog is hardly an indicator of how racist their work may be. Shakespeare wrote 40 plays. He had like 3 Black characters. So while that statistic is interesting, raw math doesn't tell us anything useful. Context and impact are important. So let's get down to the grits of the matter. Which characters are we talking about specifically? Here are the 3 biggies. Dick Halloran from The Shining, Mother Abigail from The Stand, John Coffey from The Green Mile. There are others. Speedy Parker from King's 1984 collaboration with Peter Straub, The Talisman, comes to mind, and some characters remain open to debate. But these 3, Dick, Mother Abigail, John Coffey, make up the unsavory trinity of Stephen King's magical Negro cabal. First up, Dick Halloran, The Shining, and Dr. Sleep. Dick Halloran is not only King's first magical Negro, but his first real Black character of any note. Overall, Dick is pretty mild and not patently offensive in description or behavior, though he does, refer to himself, the word nigger is flying around. Early on in the story, he reveals himself to be in possession of psychic powers, what he refers to as the Shining. At that point, he does what most magical Negroes do. Sets up a white character for narrative success, then falls off the radar for most of the story. He does reappear during the climax after making a cross-country trek to save Wendy and Danny Torrance, which should make him the hero, except you would never treat a hero you respect like that in the story. That's how you treat a plot device, and it makes his character disposable by way of erasure. Dick's only job in the story is to prop up Danny and then show up when needed to wrap things up. He isn't imbued with much story of his own, very little in the way of personality, and given practically nothing to do, despite his great wisdom and experience. He's the book's janitor. For those of you who have only seen the movie version of Dick, spoiler alert, Jack Torrance doesn't drive an axe into Dick's chest within moments of his return to the Overlook Hotel, making Dick's rescue mission utterly pointless. That's a Kubrick invention, but it's a choice King will revisit in other manifestations. Side note, those of you up on your African American folklore are probably wondering if there's any connection between Dick, the Shining, and the traditional folk trickster Shine, whose Titanic sinking survival is literally legend. I can tell you with 99.9% assuredness that based on King's self-admitted reading habits, which I will mention much later, this wasn't even remotely a consideration. In fact, if he had heard of it, it just would have made matters worse. Next up, Mother Abigail, The Stand. The Stand is arguably Stephen King's greatest novel. Not his best and not my favorite, but it is perhaps his greatest writing feat. King has certainly written better books since then, but greatness is a determination with a lot of vectors, and time only amplifies the Stand's status. It also features Mother Abigail, who is somehow integral to the novel while not being in very much of it. She is not the only Black character in The Stand. There's Ratman, who was a deplorable late game henchman, and Richard Hoggins, who was a 2-page drug addict who ODs as soon as we meet him. But Mother Abigail is the magical one. She is more avatar than person, which tees her up just right for magical Negro status. To wit, Mother Abigail is basically a toothless, doting mammy, a daughter of former enslaved persons, no less, possessing magical powers. So she's one of those double stack stereotypes I mentioned earlier. After numerous pages of early backstory, Mother Abigail has visions of great darkness and evil and acts as a beacon for the coming of white people who actually populate this novel, working to save the day. She walks to a nearby farm for 2 days to snag some chickens to cook for the white protagonist. Then, after cooking dinner for everyone, she promptly disappears for much of the rest of the book. This after not even showing up until halfway in the story. Mother Abigail then reappears later, just in time to die a good servant's death to her lord and her white people. She checks every single box on Okorafor's magical Negro dance card. 1, she's a person of color in a story about predominantly white characters. 2, she seems to have nothing better to do than to help white protagonists. 3, she disappears and upon reappearing dies while helping the white protagonist. 4, she's uneducated and poor. 5, she is wise, patient, and spiritually in touch. She literally has magical powers. To compound matters, we must also contend with the way Stephen King describes her. King describes Mother Abigail as being extremely dark-skinned, or in his words, she looked like an old Black Everglades gator. On the next page, she's referred to as having a strange living rock face seamed with veins of coal. As we'll see later, King likes using coal to describe Black people. Side note, what's interesting is that in the 1994 miniseries, which King himself wrote the screenplay for, Mother Abigail isn't quite like the physical description of her in the book at all. She is played by the late, great Ruby Dee, who was a lot of things, but coal-colored wasn't one of them. The less said about the 2020 miniseries adaptation, the better. But there is one thing I should mention about it regarding this character. The most recent series has a number of different writers over its 9 episodes, but King shows up to pen the last one, which contains material not in the book and is a bit of an epilogue. He wanted to revisit the story and some of the characters, and so we are treated to a new character, a young Black girl who appears in a cornfield to a couple of the main characters, Franny and Stu. After some cryptic conversation and magical healing, we gather that the girl is a reincarnation of Mother Abigail, and she's back to her old magical Negro tricks. This is a key point for the people who defend King's use of the trope early in his career. I'm here to point out that given free reign to imagine the ending of The Stand, he can't help but to pull the magical Negro trigger again in 2020. In conclusion, Mother Abigail is a perfectly drawn magical Negro in every way. Which brings us to the main event. John Coffey, The Green Mile, 1996. For those of you who have seen Frank Darabont's film but not read the book, know that the movie is 95% note for note like the story. So you'll be able to follow along just fine here, even if you haven't read it. As mentioned earlier, The Green Mile came out as a serialized novel from March to August in 1996. The story centers around events that take place on the death row of fictional Cold Mountain Penitentiary in the very non-fictional Louisiana. A black inmate, John Coffey, is brought in to await death by electrocution. During his stay on the Green Mile, which is what the folks at Cold Mountain call their death row, various supernatural things happen for which Coffey is responsible. But the most affirming development is that the guards determine that Coffey is in fact innocent of the murders he is convicted of. How does King describe John Coffey through the various lenses of his characters? For that, I'm actually going to read straight from the book, page 10 of my version. John Coffey was black, like most of the men who came to stay for a while in E Block before dying in old Sparky's lap. And he stood 6 feet 8 inches tall. He wasn't all willowy like the TV basketball fellows, though. He was broad in the shoulders and deep to the chest, laced over with muscle in every direction. They'd put him in the biggest denims they could find in stores. And still, the cuffs of the pants rode halfway up on his bunched and scarred calves. The shirt was open to below his chest, and the sleeves stopped somewhere on his forearms. He was holding his cap in one huge hand, which was just as well. Perched on his bald, mahogany ball of a head, it would have looked like the kind of cap an organ grinder's monkey wears, only blue instead of red. He looked like he could have snapped the chains that held him as easily as you might snap the ribbons on a Christmas present. But when you looked in his face, you knew he wasn't going to do anything like that. It wasn't dull, although that was what Percy thought. It wasn't long before Percy was calling him the idiot, but lost. He kept looking around as if to make out where he was, maybe even who he was. My first thought was that he looked like a black Samson, only after Delilah had shaved him smooth as her faithless little hand and taken all the fun out of him. Okay. And that's just the introduction of the character, right? John Coffey is a brute. He's barely clothed. He's stupid. He's referred to as an idiot, and then big dummy, and then black man next door to an idiot. He is presented as utterly childlike. He's subhuman, referred to in subhuman manners. He's referred to as a monkey, big mutt, big boy. He is presented to us as a rapist / killer. And through all of that, he's presented as obedient. Also, John Coffey is presented as alien. He's completely othered. The quote in there is like, things seem new to him. He is, quote, from the South, but not of the South. John, can you tell this is exhausting, this part right here? Like this whole character. John Coffey then proceeds to become the most magical Negro ever created. He heals, he afflicts, he predicts, he possesses, he resurrects, and finally, he dies for the sins of white others. John Coffey's initials are JC, literally Jesus Christ, as admitted by Stephen King himself. John Coffey is not only a magical Negro, he is the biggest, blackest buck King could conceive of. And he spends no small amount of time remarking on his physicality. His powers are immense, yet he does almost nothing in service to himself. He is a blank slate as a person, having no discernible background or family or agenda. He is illiterate. He is eager to help white people, and he has no problem dying, even though everyone in the room knows he's innocent. John Coffey is a constant presence in the book, which is not how magical Negroes traditionally figure into stories. But under no circumstances is he driving the narrative. The story is told in white first person with almost no extended conversations with Coffey to get at what personality he might actually possess. John Coffey doesn't do anything so much as things happen to him, and he slowly and magically responds in muted fashion. John Coffey is, for my money, King's most notable magical Negro. He is the one people who haven't even read the book know, mostly because of the film adaptation. Frankly, I was surprised this film got made. But then you should never underestimate Hollywood's thirst for stories of Black people, all too happy to cater to the well-being and growth of white people. Think about Green Book. Think about Driving Miss Daisy, and so on. So, those are King's 3 top of the pile magic Negroes. But if you'll bear with me, I want to expound on what we're seeing. I want to dig a little deeper because, as it turns out, there's another problem. The sheer number of magical Negroes in King's catalog is enough to bring this issue to the table. But what really raised my eyebrows was the way in which his Black people, magical or not, are presented. As I dug deeper and deeper into his work, most of which I had already read, mind you, I began to notice more and more problems. Stephen King's Black characters are, with few exceptions, written as caricatures of Black people, often in confounding ways. After no small amount of soul searching and rereading, I've come to a different, more conflicting conclusion than Stephen King's magical Negro issue. And that is, King's magical Negro problem isn't magical at all. It is a problem with Negroes. And that problem is actually worse than the magical Negro problem. So let's investigate King's non-magical Negro problem. King's Black characters aren't always magical, but they're almost always a problem. Often, when they are not magical, they are still rooted in some other stereotype. I'm going to pull out some characters to illustrate this, and we're going to bounce around in time a little for this part. And the slide that you're looking at now has some characters that I won't go into depth here, but they're there, and you can look them up if you're so inclined. But let's start with a softball. Dan Killian from The Running Man, 1982. The Running Man is a short novel from early in King's career, written under his Richard Bachman pseudonym. It was turned into a horrible movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger that was nothing like the book. Just act like it has nothing to do with it. But one way it differs is in the race swap of its antagonist, a game show producer named Dan Killian. In the book, King refers to Killian this way. The man behind the desk was of middle height and very black. So black, in fact, that for a moment Richard was struck with unreality. He might have stepped out of a minstrel show. I mean, moving on. Let's go back to the stand. So there are some wild uses of the word nigger and coon in the stand, mainly as concerns Mother Abigail's backstory. But we need to jump to a whole different section of the book because there's a scene that needs unpacking. It's the Black Junta scene. In a series of brief vignettes, King is describing how society is quickly falling apart during a widespread pandemic in which people are becoming infected and like instantly dying, but not before some of them get down to some truly bizarre behavior. Cue this scene in which a television studio is taken over by some colorful characters live on the air. I'm going to read this passage for a minute. At 9:16 p.m. EST, those still well enough to watch television in the Portland, Maine area tuned in WCSH-TV and watched with numbed horror as a huge black man, naked except for a pink leather loincloth and a Marine officer's cap, obviously ill, performed a series of 62 public executions. His colleagues, also black, also nearly naked, all wore loincloths and some badge of rank to show they had once belonged in the military. They were armed with automatic and semi-automatic weapons. In the area where a studio audience had once watched local political debates and dialing for dollars, more members of this black junta covered perhaps 200 khaki-clad soldiers with rifles and handguns. The huge black man who grinned a lot, showing amazingly even and white teeth in his coal black face, was holding a .45 automatic pistol and standing beside a large glass drum. In a time that already seemed long ago, that drum had held scraps of cut-up telephone books for the Dialing for Dollars program. Now I'm going to stop there, but it keeps going for, I don't know, a couple pages or so. But like, wow, right? Like, how do you fix your typewriter to create that in 1990? But let's fight through the reeling offensiveness of that couple of paragraphs, which goes on for a few pages, mind you, and pull out the anti-blackness we've observed. The black junta members are described as follows. Coal black, again with the coal descriptor in this book. Mindless, brutes, sexualized. They're stupid. They're armed. They're randomly violent. Kills white people for no reason. A raw, literally naked white fear. The black soldiers are naturally tribal. I mean, that list, yo. Something that bears pointing out is that this scene is from the 1990 unabridged version of The Stand. This scene was not in the original 1978 book. I checked, and it wasn't easy because you can't find the 1978 original version sitting in a bookstore somewhere. It's been completely replaced in the marketplace in nearly every library by the 1990 revision. I had to do some real digging to come up with a copy of it to compare notes with, which was made even more difficult by the sheer amount of reconstruction that King did. He added over 300 pages to the book, 12 years after the original. The Black Junta scene isn't in the 1978 version. He had to decide to put this scene back in or write it fresh for this edition. Both of those possibilities are terrifying. Next up, Odetta Holmes, Detta Walker, Susanna Dean from the Dark Tower series. Now, personally speaking, I'm not a fan of the Dark Tower stuff. We still have a lot of ground to cover. But it would be remiss of me to skip this well-known character and how she illustrates King's patterns. Odetta Holmes first appears in the second book of the series, The Drawing of the Three. Odetta is a civil rights era woman of means living in New York City in the 1960s. She comes from money and fights for civil rights causes. She had her legs amputated after being pushed in a subway accident, and despite being wheelchair bound, is transported into the world of the Dark Tower to join up with the crew of characters on various adventures over several books. What's most notable about Odetta Holmes is that after having a brick dropped on her head when she was a child, she spontaneously generates a second personality, Detta Walker. Odetta is unaware of Detta, who appears during blackouts that last hours, sometimes days. More on that in a second. Odetta is pleasant, soft-spoken, and smart, a good Christian woman. She is the sole heir of her family's dental industry empire, so she's rich. She appeared on the cover of Time magazine, so she's well known. King describes her as being almost as famous as Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, to better illustrate what she is, King resorts to many uses of the word nigger, albeit funneled through a pedestrian perspective. Once again, we have King defining a Black character's presence as an object of racial derision. Again, I want to keep drawing attention to the fact that while readers who claim that King isn't doing anything wrong by putting these constant niggers in the mouths and minds of bad characters, he does it in ways that are excessive and shock for shock's sake. Worse, as the narrator, specifically as limited third-person narrator, he loves speaking for racists who aren't in the room. In the drawing of the three, he spends half a page describing Odetta's accomplishments almost entirely as the accomplishments of an uppity nigger. I'm going to read a passage from that. This is how he describes Odetta. It wasn't just that she was a woman. She was a nigger, an uppity northern nigger, messing where she had no business messing. And they probably figured a woman like that deserved what she got. Thing was, she was also a rich nigger. Thing was, she was almost as well known to the American public as Medgar Evers or Martin Luther King. Thing was, she'd gotten her rich nigger face on the cover of Time magazine, and it was a little harder to get away with sticking someone like that in the toolies and then saying, "What? No, sir, boss. We sure didn't see nobody look like that down here, did we, boys?" Thing was, it was a little harder to work yourself up to hurting a woman who was the only heir to Holmes Dental Industries when there were 12 Holmes plants in the sunny South, blah, 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 blah. You see what I'm saying? Mind you, there are no actual racists in the scene. Just her driver looking at her damaged suitcases after a trip down south. This is all descriptive language on the part of the author using how other characters perceive her as a framing device. The problem is that he frames her entirely through the lens of bigots and not at all through the eyes of the thousands of people helped by her civil rights work. It's like having a Black History Month program produced by the Klan. And then there's Odetta's alternate personality, Detta Walker. In Detta, King creates something of a crazed, reverse racist superwoman. Where Odetta Holmes is God-fearing, Detta Walker is all sin. She steals, she curses, she backstabs. She's just generally a sick and evil person. Detta Walker hates white people, speaks in a hard, curse-laden, extremely stereotypical dialect that isn't present when she isn't Detta. Odetta. I'm sorry. When the dialect's not present when she isn't Detta. She's basically everything that Odetta Holmes isn't. And in the drawing of the three, she's practically a villain. What's telling about how this character comes to the reader is that Stephen King clearly has at least a rudimentary understanding of civil rights history. He knows who Rosa Parks is and why she's famous. He spends a bit of time painting a picture of the movement and how to place Odetta in it. And yet, armed with that history and knowledge, he gives us all these problems. It makes me wonder whether or not Detta Walker attacks, interrogates, or assuages his self-admitted white liberal guilt. Or is it just him using a black character in a horrific way for shock value again? Just to cover our bases here, I need to point out that through a feat of supernatural shenanigans, Odetta and Detta merge into a third personality, Susanna Dean. She's far more useful than Odetta and leagues more reasonable than Detta, and she is who we follow through the rest of the series for the most part. Which brings me to the next entry. Dedication from 1993. This is a short story. It was originally published in 1988 in the anthology Night Visions 5, and then later under the title Dark Visions, and then appeared finally in King's 1993 short story collection, Nightmares and Dreamscapes. So Dedication has gotten around, but it also has the distinction of quite possibly being the most damning bit of racism in King's canon. Dedication is also possibly the first incarnation of a lead black character in a Stephen King story of any length. So it is notable for that reason alone, though we pay dearly for it. This is a story that doesn't have a magical Negro so much as a Negro affected by magic. What's the premise, you ask? Brace yourselves. A black hotel maid, Martha Rosewall, is recounting to a coworker the story of how she believes her son, Peter, a newly published author, obtained his writing ability from, wait for it, the numerous times she consumed a racist author's post-masturbatory semen from the bedsheet she changed each day while pregnant with her son. You absolutely heard that description correctly. In this tale, Martha is nothing more than a vessel for the transformative powers of a senile racist skeet. A magic so powerful that it can add talent to an unborn black baby actually fathered by her black husband. Dedication is sexist, racist, and emasculating all at once. A tour de force of white supremacy turned inside out. It is a powerfully offensive intersection of anti-blackness and gross misogyny. I would read an excerpt of this, but it's too gross for general audience consumption. Next up, Jerome Robinson from Mr. Mercedes, 2014. Jerome Robinson, which sounds like it came out of a black character name generator, appears in the Bill Hodges trilogy of books, as well as the 2020 short story If It Bleeds. The Bill Hodges trilogy of books refers to the main character, Hodges, who is a retired police detective. When we meet Bill, he is beset with alcoholism, suicide ideation, and it isn't doing much with his life until the chance to crack an unsolved case reemerges. Now, Jerome Robinson is Bill Hodges' neighbor, a really smart high school kid who cuts his grass and does various chores for him. When the mass murder case comes into Bill's life, he enlists Jerome to guide him through the wily and nefarious interwebs to catch his man. Now, there's an almost magical quality about Jerome that stems from aging white guy impressions of how basic technology works and Jerome's ability to make it work on his behalf. I think there are magical Negro tendencies here, but Jerome's really more of a nerd trope handled with racist gloves. What I mean is, once again, to paint a picture of a black character, King resorts to racist caricature. Jerome writes these little notes to Bill and occasionally speaks in like an Amos and Andy style voice, for laughs. Here, I will read one of those notes. Dear Massa Hodges, I has mowed your grass and put the mower back in your carport. I hopes you didn't run over it, sir. If you has any more chores for this here black boy, hit me on my honker. I'll be happy to talk to you if I is not on the job with one of my hoes. As you know, they needs a lot of work and sometimes some tuning up on them, as they can be uppity, especially them high yellers. I is always here for you, sir, Jerome. I, I mean, this is a teenager, like in 2014. Like he shouldn't even know how to write that. Like you paint this kid as being brilliant, and then this. I, I Next up, end of watch, 2016. So I know some of you are still reeling from the description of dedication and Jerome's letter. So here's a little, shall we say, cake. You just met Jerome, right? Well, he has a little sister named Barbara Robinson. She also appears in Mr. Mercedes, in which we meet Jerome. She's mostly just a supporting character in that one. But in the third book of the series, End of Watch, Barbara gets some real stage time. But as you can imagine, due to the fact that she appears here, it's a bit of a mess. To be clear, Barbara is mostly harmless as Black Stephen King characters go. She's an innocent and presents like any other modern kid. King keeps tying her to the railroad tracks in these books, but she's mostly just a damsel in distress engine to get the main cast of characters doing their thing. In End of Watch, the distress that Barbara is put in isn't a killer who wants to blow up the concert she's attending or a monster who wants to tear her apart, but a walk through a black neighborhood called Lowtown, centered on a trip down Martin Luther King Boulevard. This is perhaps the most laughable excursion into racism you'll encounter in this lecture. And frankly, it's a high point for me because King is really telegraphing his "I understand black people now" punches. The problem is, I'm convinced he's learned all of these things from television shows and movies. So I'm going to read this section and I'm going to interrupt myself as I go because it's so ludicrous to see how King imagines a black world in 2016. For bonus points, see how many pop references you can catch King drawing his knowledge of black people from. For those of you who like to play along at home, this excerpt will begin on page 135. I'm going to go for a minute. Here we go. 19 blocks from where Hodges is returning his iPhone to his overcoat pocket, there is another world. Not a very nice one. Jerome Robinson's sister is there, and she is in trouble. Pretty and demure in her Chapel Ridge school uniform, gray wool coat, gray skirt, white knee socks, red scarf wrapped around her neck. Barbara walks down Martin Luther King Avenue with the yellow Zappit Commander in her gloved hands. On it, the fishing hole fish dart and swim, although they are almost invisible in the cold, bright light of midday. MLK is one of two main thoroughfares in the part of the city known as Lowtown. And although the population is predominantly black, and Barbara is herself black, make that cafe au lait, she has never been here before, and that single fact makes her feel stupid and worthless. These are her people. Their collective ancestors might have toted barges and lifted bales on the same plantation back in the day, for all she knows, and yet she has never been here one single time. She has been warned away not only by her parents, but by her brother. Lowtown's where they drink the beer and then eat the bottle it came in, he told her once. No place for a girl like you. A girl like me, she thinks. A nice upper middle class girl like me, who goes to a nice private school and has nice white girlfriends and plenty of nice preppy clothes and an allowance. Why, I even have a bank card. I can withdraw $60 from an ATM anytime I want. Amazeballs. Amazeballs. She walks like a girl in a dream. And it's a little like a dream because it's all so strange. And it's less than 2 miles from home, which happens to be a cozy Cape Cod with an attached 2-car garage, mortgage, all paid off. She walks past check cashing joints and pawn shops filled with guitars and radios and gleaming pearl handled straight razors. Straight razors, yo. She walks past bars that smell of beer, even with the doors closed against the January cold. She walks past hole in the wall restaurants that smell of grease. Some sell pizza by the slice, some sell Chinese. In the window of one is a propped sign reading, "Hush puppies and collard greens like your mama used to make." Not my mama, Barbara thinks. I don't even know what a collard green is. Spinach? Cabbage? Ooh. On the excuse me. On the corners, every corner it seems, boys in long shorts and loose jeans are hanging out. Sometimes standing close to rusty fire barrels to keep warm. Sometimes playing hacky sack. I'm sorry. Hold on. Wait, I gotta stop for a second. Let me be clear. Stephen King thinks that bruhs on the corner standing next to burning trash barrels playing hacky sack. I'm sorry. Let me get back to. I'm sorry. Sometimes playing hacky sack. Sometimes just living in their gigantic sneakers, their jackets hung open in spite of the cold. They shout yo to their homies and hail passing cars. And when one stops, they hand small glassine envelopes through the open window. She walks block after block of MLK. 9, 10, maybe a dozen. She's lost count. And each corner is like a drive-through for drugs of 4 hamburgers or tacos. What? She passes shivering women dressed in hot pants, short fake fur jackets, and shiny boots. On their heads, they wear amazing wigs of many colors. That sounds like a prostitute from like, this is me interrupting again. That sounds like a prostitute from like an old Eddie Murphy movie. Anyhow, She passes empty buildings with boarded up windows. She passes a car that has been stripped to the axles and covered with gang tags. She passes a woman with a dirty bandage over one eye. The woman is dragging a screeching toddler by the arm. She passes a man sitting on a blanket who drinks from a bottle of wine and wiggles his gray tongue at her. It's poor and it's desperate and it's been right here all along, and she never did anything about it. Never did anything, never even thought about it. What she did was her homework. What she did was talk on the phone and text with her BFFs at night. What she did was update her Facebook status and worry about her complexion. She is your basic teen parasite, dining in nice restaurants with her mother and father while her brothers and sisters, right here all along, less than 2 miles from her nice suburban home, drink wine and take drugs to blot out their terrible lives. She, God, Stephen King is on one, yo. She is ashamed of her hair hanging smoothly to her shoulders. She is ashamed of her clean white knee socks. She is ashamed of her skin colors because it's the same as theirs. I mean, which one is it, dog? Is she brown skin or is she catfield? Like, whatever. Hey, Blackish! It's a yell from the other side of the street. What you doing down here? You got no business down here. Blackish. It's the name of a TV show. They watch it at home and laugh, but it's also what she is. Not black, but blackish. It's Stephen King. Yo. Stephen King is trying to tell you. He's trying to break down colorism. Oh my God. Living a white life in a white neighborhood, she can do that because her parents make lots of money and own a home on a block where people are so screamingly non-prejudiced that they cringe if they hear one of their kids call another one dumbhead. Dumbhead. She can live that wonderful white life because she is a threat to no one. She no rocka the boat. Holy my God. I don't know. So I just want to be clear that she lives a wonderful white life because she's not poor and her parents have money and they have a house and they own things, as if black people don't do these things. She just goes her way, chattering with her friends about boys and music and boys and clothes and boys and the TV programs they all like and which girl they saw walking with which boy at the Birch Hill Mall. She is blackish, a word that means the same as useless, and she doesn't deserve to live. Okay, I gotta stop. I gotta put this book down. There's so much presumption. There's so much wrong with all of that, but there's so much presumption in those pages. So much just enough knowledge to be a problem, but not enough to be the solution in those pages. So much guilt, so much ridiculous pandering and casual racism. It's a hot mess, but it's totally how so many people that never go in black neighborhoods actually envision them. King writes like black people live in haunted houses and murder gauntlets. It would be distressing if it weren't so laughable. Lowtown is just a mishmash of wildly stereotypical drive-by observations of what a black neighborhood is. Not projections of what a black neighborhood is. It's the kind of vibe you get in the comment sections of newspapers when they cover black neighborhoods and businesses. What's most disappointing about this section is that King knows how to write about distressed spaces. King grew up poor. He knows what it takes to navigate and survive poverty. He just thinks black poverty is somehow different than the poverty he knows. And it is, but not in the way he paints it. It isn't a Fox News amusement park of horrors. Anyhow, let's talk about a black character King almost got right. Mike Hanlon It. Mike probably has the most backstory of any black character in King's canon, more than even Mother Abigail in The Stand, if we go by raw page count. He has relationships with other people and a living parent in his father. He hangs out with his friends in the loser gang. And while horrible things happen to Mike in his time in the cursed town of Derry, he generally rises above the character driven racism. The supernatural clown, not so much. Growing up, Mike is bullied and terrorized by his neighbor, Henry Bowers. Mike is the keeper of his family history, becomes the town librarian, calls the other members of the losers back to Derry when Pennywise resurfaces and begins killing again. So Mike is brave and committed to defeating Pennywise. He is the only member of the losers to stay in Derry, despite everything he faces, even when there isn't a terrifying alien clown trying to kill him. King uses rampant racism against Mike's family to show that the town of Derry is bad and that Mike has it hard coming up. This is one of the few instances in which I felt that King's penchant for drawing racist figures with offensive language, ideas, and behaviors was more or less justified. I'd like to think that Mike Hanlon's father wouldn't use the word nigger in recounting the legion of white decency in Derry. I would have assumed he'd say something like colored, like most real black people of the time period. But compared to the rest of the book, it's a small quibble. On the other hand, Mike's friend Richie Tozier's, and conversely Pennywise, pickaninny Jim voice is mad unnecessary. It's like, Richie, dude, you're supposed to be Mike's boy. Can a brother find one place in town where he don't catch abuse, especially with his friends? The other losers tell Richie to shut up about it all the time, but it's not quite a full-throated defense. I wouldn't have minded a scene where Richie is doing his yes massive voice and Mike casually walks over and throat punches him without saying a word. Then they could continue being lifelong friends, if that's what Mike wants, with an actual understanding of the problem and its consequences. I say this as someone who has had to walk away from numerous white folks who thought that kind of thing was funny. Richard Tozier is real. Bonus point. Guess who makes an appearance in a story about a black nightclub being burned to the ground by racists? Why, magical Negro Dick Halloran in his young military years before taking a job at the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. Dick manages to squeeze in a nigger here too. Now, here's a quick word on how the movie messed Mike up. Some people feel the movie adaptation of It messed Mike Hanlon up and made a magical Negro where there wasn't one. How? By reducing his backstory and role. His original charge as the kid who knows the town's history, which was totally informed and motivated by the racist treatment he received, is stripped and given to another character entirely, Ben Haskell. The Mike Hanlon we are left with in the film pales to his literary counterpart. Less to do puts him more in position to be of service only. Having said that, is Mike a magical Negro after all, even in the book? This one is hard to say. If you look at him in the specific, it wouldn't seem so. But if you blow out his overall participation in the story arc, a case could be made. Mike's overall purpose seems to boil down to activating the rest of the losers and then disappearing. Admittedly, he's injured, but gone from the climax nonetheless. Mike willingly gives up any chance of happiness to stay behind in Derry and basically lay the groundwork for the final confrontation by every other character but himself. So it's possible that Mike Hanlon rises to the label of magical Negro. Despite his many pages of journaling, he is a tokenized character, and he is punished for being so. The temptation to look at the amount of pages he gets in it suggests that we know a lot about Mike. And conversely, he isn't there simply in service to white characters. But when you look at the timeline of his activity, things swing the other way. Mike Hanlon is a token. The question is he a magical Negro as well? Depends on who you ask. I come down on Mike being too present in the narrative to be a pure magical Negro, but he's definitely a token. Okay. One more book and we're almost done. This one doesn't fit neatly under either of the previous categories that we've been discussing, magical Negroes or Black people treated horribly for being Black. This one is something else, and it says something about us as an audience, as well as King as a writer, but also perhaps a person. I want to talk about the woke Stephen King. Over the last several years, Stephen King has expressed a penchant for the political, largely galvanized by the campaign and presidency of Donald Trump, but not exclusively. King, who spends a lot of time on Twitter for someone who puts out 2 books a year, has sounded off on various social justice issues and politics at large to millions of followers. He is decidedly anti-Trump and anti-racism. He's a liberal, to be sure. This manifested most notably in 2016 with a tweet about 25-year-old Freddie Gray, a Black Baltimore man who in 2015 was picked up by Baltimore police and sustained grievous injuries while in their custody. Gray died from those injuries a week later. After one of the officers, Cesar Goodson Jr., was found not guilty of all charges filed against him, King posted the following on Twitter. June 23rd, 2016. Gee, looks like nobody killed Freddie Gray. Guess he just died of being Black. Funny how that happens in this country, end quote. Somewhere along the way, Stephen King, who again has always leaned liberal, got full-blown woke. He even capitalized Black in the tweet. He would go on to post various things over the years about social issues, even as recently as last month when he posted, January 21, 2022, McConnell's remark about African Americans vis-a-vis Americans wasn't a mistake, it was a Freudian slip. Now, this was in response to Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's retort to a question by a reporter about Republican blockage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, in which McConnell said, well, the concern is misplaced because if you look at the statistics, African American voters are voting in just as high a percentage as Americans, end quote. That differentiation between African Americans and whatever McConnell meant by simply Americans was, of course, backpedaled. But the damage was done, and Stephen King got his pound of flesh out of it on Twitter. But I want to talk about 2017. That year, King published the novel Sleeping Beauties, co-written with his son, Owen King. The premise: all over the world, women who fall asleep become mysteriously cocooned when roused from their slumber. They awaken in a murderous frenzy, killing whoever is nearby before returning to sleep. The book's story takes place in a town called Dooling, which has to be the most diverse Appalachian town I've ever encountered. And much of the tale unfolds in a nearby women's prison where some Mother Earth / alternate dimension stuff is going down. Basically, the book is doing a lot. At 700 pages, it is an enormous book with dozens of characters, definitely written with some of the new woke tics that are finding their way into his writing. These tics are a hyper awareness of social issues, which is not great or entertaining reading, but I can't knock him too hard for it. It is pretty much the only way you're going to get Stephen King to engage social issues at length through the writing. And I'd rather he do this than not. I haven't yet crunched the numbers on how this new tact may have affected how often he uses racial slurs, but I bet good money the count has gone down on a per book average. If I were an academic, I'd have an intern combing through those pages to get it down to actual numbers or something, but maybe I'll make time for that debilitating task in the future. Something that must be mentioned is Sleeping Beauty's dedication. The book is dedicated to Sandra Bland. Sandra Bland was a 28-year-old Black woman who was found hanged in a jail cell in Waller County, Texas in 2015, 3 days after being arrested during a traffic stop. Her death, which was ruled a suicide, was followed by protest against her arrest, disputing the cause of death and alleging racial violence against her. The dedication concerned me because King's record on Blacks was bad enough without intersecting womanhood, on which his record is even worse. What was even more telling was that no review I read mentioned this dedication. I'm going to come back to this point in a bit. I went into this book with a creeping concern that he was gleaning what people are about from binging television shows, like what I saw in End of Watch and Lowtown. My fear was that Sleeping Beauties would be King's radicalized version of Orange is the New Black, which is in fact referenced. Also in the front of the book is a roll call of 47 characters listed that we encounter in the town of Dueling, followed by another list of 20 characters in the prison, followed by 5 more random characters. All told, before we read a page of this story, we are informed/warned that this book is going to sprawl to the tune of 72 characters. So I'm reading this gargantuan novel just when I think there aren't any Black characters, which couldn't possibly be true in a 700-page Stephen King novel with a prison in it. We are introduced to Frank Geary. Frank is 38, and he works as an animal control officer in Dueling. We meet him on page 35. Correction, we meet Frank on page 35. We meet his Blackness on page 72. 37 pages later, I'm gonna read an excerpt of that, page 72. Now, mind you, at this point, we have met Frank a couple of times in the story, but this is when we find out he's Black. And here's how we find out he's Black. Nothing Frank said or did could change her mind. It was either a trial separation or divorce, and Frank chose the former. And her prediction had been wrong. He hadn't snapped. Never would. He was strong. He was a protector, which left a fairly important question. What was he trying to prove? What benefit was she getting by putting him through this? Was it some unresolved childhood issue? Was it plain old sadism? Whatever it was fucking unreal and fucking senseless. You did not, as an African-American man in the Tri-Counties, or any county in the United States, arrive at the age of 38 without encountering far more than your fair share of senselessness. Racism was the epitome of senselessness after all. So I'm going to stop there. This might be the first time I've ever read a Black King character introduced as an African American and not something else like Minstrel Show Black or Alligator Black or Pitch Black. The reason why you don't pick up on Frank's race is because traditionally, When King introduces a black character, he makes no bones about their blackness. See all of the previous characters introduced in this lecture. When King sees a black character in his mind, he makes sure that the reader is aware of it in the most bluntly efficient way possible. Here, King pulls a racial switcheroo. It also turns out that Frank gets a lot of pages. Even with a large ensemble class, he's close to lead character territory, which would make Sleeping Beauties, King's first book with a black lead. This is monumental, and I don't think it's lost on King either. In over 60 novels spanning almost 50 years, King hadn't done that. It's a big deal. And what does King do after that? After the Frank switcheroo? He does it again, but this time even harder. A character that's introduced on page 1, prisoner Jeanette Sorley, also turns out to be black on page 308. What? Her cellmate Ree was a bit of a red herring. Her speech, having a Michelle Obama dream, whatever. But Jeanette gets a ton of page time, which makes Sleeping Beauties King's first novel with 2 black leads. There are a number of leads, for the record. It is an ensemble piece, but 2 of them are black. That's unprecedented in a Stephen King novel to this extent. Of course, one of them is a raging, abusive jerk, and the other is a criminal who gets killed. So if you had any questions about how they're treated, the answer is about as you'd expect. These characters aren't a problem on par with some of the black characters I've discussed per se. They are useful in revealing his attempt to consciously navigate the issue of race in the last generation. Perhaps to his discredit, he does this as a parlor trick for his largely and perennially white audience. He sneaks his black leads in here. I don't know if that's a good thing. It's better than what he's done before, so I take it as a sign of growth. It shows an awareness that was definitely missing before. In the handful of novels King has written since this one, black characters appear, but he seems to have more or less gotten the worst descriptors for them out of his system. Here's a quick bit of trivia as we pull up into the conclusion. This is a list of magical Negroes King did not make, but Hollywood did. These are characters that were white in King's books, but weren't once they changed medium, right? So the Dark Tower film, Roland the Gunslinger, now black, made him a magical Negro. Dr. Sleep, Abra Stone, who's technically a co-protagonist. The Pet Sematary remake, Victor Pascal, is now black. In the Outsider series, Holly Gibney, who King writes a lot over several books and stories for the series, black. And an honorable mention, because King didn't create this character at all, is the Castle Rock series. Henry Matthew Deaver. This is a new character who's quite magical, but not a magical Negro. Because he's the lead protagonist. All right. In conclusion, after giving just a fraction of this information to people in the past, I have been asked why I bother reading him. To which I usually respond, what do white people have against being asked to do better? When somebody says, well, what do you expect from a guy born and raised in all white Maine who writes fiction? They ask this as if it is an unknown. They believe they are giving a reason for the bad action in question, as if that information is new or missing in the conversation. The reality is that when you say that to people who know and understand that background, you aren't providing a new understanding, you're providing an excuse. And that excuse only works on people who want to stop feeling complicit in the effect of this work, not for people who want to learn and be better. I often encounter self described hardcore King fans who missed this language. They remember the use of the word nigger in, say, the conversation between, let's say, Jack and the ghost of Delbert Grady in The Shining, who refers to Dick as the nigger cook. But they seem less foggy on recalling the ending. Or I should say they seem more foggy when they recall the ending of The Shining, when the hotel is psychically attacking Dick directly, throwing every stereotype and slur in the book at him in an attempt to get him to do harm to the family instead of saving them, which is funny to me because if you wanted to convince most Black people to do something, calling them a bunch of racist names is a surefire way to not get that work done. King has used the word nigger since his first book, Carrie. Even when Black folks aren't present, we catch this heat. What's also interesting in some fans' defense of this kind of language is that the books written in the 1970s, as if the books were released during segregation or Jim Crow, like nigger means something different now than it did 50 years ago. Not to mention the fact that you can find the same language, imagery, and context in his books well into the modern era. We can debate why King does it so frequently, but you cannot debate the frequency with which he does it, nor can you erase the various contexts in which such imagery and language appear with one lane answers. And after 50 years of it to varying degrees, I can tell you as a Black fan, it's exhausting. Also, the horror defense of the books, meaning they should by definition disturb their audiences, is a pretty lame defense. If it happened once or twice, maybe, but we're talking usage over many, many books in many, many situations. That's a lot of shock value, which, when you know he's going to probably do it, isn't so shocking and becomes something else. In all of my talk about Stephen King's characters, there's actually another discussion developing. It is a discussion about America and race and why America can't get race right. Too many people believe that talking about race creates racism, which is an idea so fundamentally wrong, I won't spend a second debunking it here. I've written thousands and thousands of words on that already outside of Stephen King. But I will point out that denying the impact of work like this on the way we process and navigate race is a surefire way to keep racism alive and well. Everybody talks about needing a conversation on race. Well, this is what I'm bringing to the table. Not because Stephen King is a stone cold bigot, but because millions of people bought and read millions of copies of work featuring characters like these, and no one ever talks about their implications and impacts. The majority of them weren't even aware that impacts might be a thing. Almost none of the reviews for Sleeping Beauties mention race or the Sandra Bland dedication, and yet it's clearly relevant, not just to that particular story, but what it says about the arc of Stephen King's awareness and politic. And what it says about Stephen King is potentially what it says about America. I won't go so far as to say, so go King, So goes America, but he's not famous for nothing. His work is substantial, ubiquitous, and has an effect on people. Checking King's work in this manner is a lot like testing the tap water to make sure it's safe to drink. We're all already drinking it. Somebody should be checking it out from time to time. Am I reading the work of a bigot? No, I don't believe so. It's absolutely the work of a white man prone to blind spots on race. But do I believe his work intends harm to Black people or race relations? No. I just think he didn't see what the harm was. And somewhere along the way, very late in his career, he figured some things out. The question isn't whether or not Stephen King has prejudices or biases or benefits from white supremacy or if he has racist thoughts. That's true for practically all white people living in America. The better question is whether or not his work functions as racism. Does it perpetuate it? Does it introduce it into the stream of things? Not if he meant his work to, but whether or not it does, regardless of his intent. And unfortunately, and I say this as a lifelong Stephen King fan, the answer is yes. How much of King's success is owed to anti-Blackness? Not much. Out of 63 novels and 11 collections, I only read from 6 or 7 books for this lecture. I mean, in terms of, reading excerpts out loud. There's a lot of King on the table that has nothing to do with Black people. Stephen King didn't need this particular device, the magical Negro, to become Stephen King, which is the point. He didn't need this device to succeed. Can a Black character be magical and not offensive? Of course. Ask Neil Gaiman, who wrote Anansi Boys and American Gods. Ask Matt Ruff, who wrote Lovecraft Country. Ask any Black student at Hogwarts. Alex Cross is not a problematic Black character. Lucas on Stranger Things is not a problematic Black character. It's not an all or nothing proposition. Freedom of expression isn't negotiable. Anyone can write what they want, always, forever. What happens as a result of that process is always up for debate, but the process is never up for debate. There's a big difference between saying white writers can't or shouldn't write non-white characters and white writers should consider how non-white characters work in their stories. Oh, it's two different things. Here's one more defense that people should probably stop using about these characters. That the characters that use slurs are bigots and are speaking in a different era. Yes, King gives villains and bad characters unpleasant traits like repellent racism. But King has lots of tools with which he paints deplorable characters when necessary. That he uses racism and racial slurs so frequently suggests that the particular tool is perhaps too handy, too quick to use. I would never deign to tell Stephen King what to write. I might suggest he use a little more imagination, or maybe a little less imagination, and a little more experience when it comes to Black folks. But here's something we can know empirically. In the back of Stephen King's 2000 book on writing, he lists 96 books by 81 authors that he'd read in the 3 to 4 years while writing several books. 18 of those authors were women out of 96. 3 of them were people of color. Out of 81. 81. 18 were women. 3 were people of color. In the 20th anniversary edition of On Writing, he added 2 more book lists. One for the period of 2001 to 2009 that had 82 books by 74 authors, and another list comprised of books he'd read from 2010 to 2019 that had 79 books by 71 authors. In the 2 later lists, which were not all of the books King read in the last 20 years, just the ones he favored enough to mention, the people of color and women count is even worse. His reading habits are as white as Maine, which is literally the whitest state in the nation. 90% white folks, 1.9% black folks as of 2020, and that's a rise in the black number. The point here is writing is diet. What you put in is what you get out. Finally, I only ask those of us who write to consider at least 5 things when we do engage characters of color based on real people with real cultures. 1, accept when you have been offensive. You don't get to tell me how I feel is invalid. 2, determine if your offense was intentional, because some education may need to take place here. 3, determine if you are genuinely sorry for that offense without denying you were offensive, right? This is the don't give a crappy apology rule. If you are sorry, education can fix these blind spots moving forward. If you aren't sorry, you're unrepentant and deserve whatever criticism you get. Number 4, ask for insight along the way, right? Read some critical literature, get some solid manuscript criticism before there's a problem. Both would be ideal. And number 5, read black books. White people act like black art is only for black people. It's not. There is an enormous amount of diversity in our literature. Don't let the library stickers scare you off. We do it all: romance, crime, mystery, science fiction, and yes, horror. If you made it this far, thank you so much for taking the time to consider the information and perspectives presented here. I'm sure for some of you, it was not an easy ride. It's not an easy ride for me to compile this information and then update it every year and then deliver it for 2 hours. I stopped buying his books in 2016 with End of Watch. Lowtown was my low point, but I do continue to read him, and not just to update this lecture every year. I'm always on the lookout for a good Stephen King book because, again, a good Stephen King book is a joy. I learned lots of things as a writer growing up on Stephen King. I probably won't ever stop reading him, but I'm always on the lookout for more of his growth as much as I am his problems. Remember, the question isn't whether or not Stephen King has prejudices or bias or benefits from white supremacy or if he has racist thoughts. The better question, the more productive question, is whether or not Stephen King's work functions as racism and what we do with that. Thank you, Streetlight Guild, for providing a home for this lecture, and thank you to Stephen King for all of the stories. And if you ever watch this, sir, the patience. Happy reading, everyone, whether it's me, Stephen King, or someone else.